everybody. Welcome to the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert. I'm here today with Shelley Neese, and we have a super special guest, Hanna Miley, a child survivor of the Holocaust and author of the book, A Garland for Ashes. Hanna brings to us a very unique perspective, something you may not have heard before, and we are excited to have her share her story, her testimony, and what her experiences as a child has meant for her adult life and how she stays engaged in these topics to today, especially today in a post-October 7 world. Hanna, Shelley and I welcome you, and we are so happy to have you with us. I will also be sharing links to your Instagram and your book for people to follow you after they hear your wonderful words of wisdom and experience. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe where you are and what you're doing now, and then we can kind of dive back into that very unique experience as a child survivor and the particular avenue that you had to get out of Europe.
Well, I want to say thank you to you, Amy, and to Shelley. This is very special for me to be able to share my story on something called the Jerusalem Connection and also Red Alert, because I think that is really at the heart of what I feel I should be doing. There is this connection to Jerusalem, to my Jewish roots, but I also feel this is a time to be really alert. So I'm kind of having this sense that we have been brought together just to exchange thoughts. And, you know, if I think about what kind of title would I like to give to this exchange today, I think I would like to give a one-word title, and I would call it reconciliation.
What's awesome.
So do you want to start asking questions, or shall I?
Sure. So when you talk about the idea of reconciliation, I'm going to, maybe you want, I know in your book, A Garland for Ashes, people can read your entire story and your entire experience as a child in Europe, a Jewish child, and that avenue that saved you. And then we can share a little bit about that, and then you can talk about what does that mean to reconcile as, Jewish people, Christians. The Israelis are dealing right now with a lot of issues. We don't need to get too much into that, other than the fact that it's this constant bombardment of attacks on the Jewish people, no matter where they are. And Christians need to stand up and stand out for them, which didn't happen in the numbers that it should have 80 years ago. But you were kind of a beneficiary of at least one righteous Gentile who took some steps to save you as a child. Why don't you give us a little glimpse of that story so we can understand who you are and how you got to where you are today in terms of your outreach into the community and how you live your life.
We can start with your parents as a way to honor them too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, I was born in 1932, and I was born in the city of Bonn in Germany. We actually lived in a small place near the Belgian border, and Bonn was the biggest city nearby with a really good hospital, because my parents were older when I was born, and my father wanted to make sure everything was really the best for the birth of his first and only child. And 11 months after I was born, Hitler seized power. And that was bad news for my parents and for me. And why was it bad news? Because we were Jews. Just about a year ago, I had my ancestry researched, and I discovered I was 100% Ashkenazi Jew.
Wow.
So that is not a good thing to be in Germany in 1933 when Hitler seized power. And we lived in a small town, which was actually a town where Germans came to breathe the beautiful air and to hike in the hills. And it was very idyllic. But during those 30s, there was a castle built by Hitler. He built several castles to replace the medieval castles and to represent his 1,000-year reign, the Reich. And the castle in our area was built 6 kilometers above our little town. And the purpose of it was to train young men in racial philosophy. And actually, after it opened in the first few years, the students who were trained there were the ones who were sent to the East. And they were part of the Einsatzgruppen who shot Jews, and they were also heads of concentration camps. So it's like this idyllic, peaceful village, which was before a very safe place for Jews. My parents had a shop on the main street, and there were other Jewish shops, and there was good relationships, apparently, with the rest of the community. But things changed. And you can imagine the kind of shadow that was cast over this town by having this very dark philosophy taught just above it.
Well, that dark philosophy, I was at an education symposium last night, and believe it or not, that dark philosophy is getting rebranded and reintroduced into our schools by our universities. And so that sends shivers up my spine that you explain that this is happening when you were an infant. And I see it happening in just a reiterated fashion today. So your family, your parents and their precious child, you're in this little community outside of Bonn. You're under the shadow of this growing evil cancer. That is just another iteration of what will try to annihilate the Jewish people. And then you're growing. So by the time Hitler starts to institute the Nuremberg laws, which was about 39 or so, 38, 39, you're now kindergarten, first grade, starting to have memories. I'm assuming you remember some of these things. What was going on then, and what was going on with your parents? Like, how were they reacting to this growing cynicism?
This is a very interesting question. You are relating it to our world today. And, the rise of authoritarianism and the prospect of it is not just America. There are so many countries that are moving in that direction. And today it's influenced by the media, and we're in our media bubbles. But in 1933 and the years following that, the propaganda was much more basic. For instance, the newspapers, the magazines, the newsreels at the cinema, and the radio were all conditioning the people to see Jews as scapegoats. So I I can share a couple of experiences of how that intruded. But first, you asked me how my parents reacted. And this is also a huge warning for today. My parents, like many Jews, thought this is so crazy, it's not going to last. And they, in their minds, thought they would ride it out. We'll just keep our heads down and we keep quiet and it will all pass over. But so we stayed in that. For me, I was totally unaware because they were incredibly protective. And which actually, I mean, I'm going all over the place, but I have this incredible friend I've found through Instagram, Laura Nathan, who's a textile artist, and she has a little daughter, age 6. And so she is struggling how to tell her daughter about the anti-Semitic threats in Manchester, England, because they're right in the middle of it. So you see, she is trying to help her daughter not be full of fear, but face it. But my parents, they protected me in this little cocoon. But that little cocoon was shattered on Kristallnacht. I don't know if that's a familiar term, but that is the night that in November 1938, all over Germany, synagogues were burnt. And it's called Kristallnacht because shop windows belonging to Jewish owners were shattered. And there had been these years of verbal marginalization and speaking of Jews as the other, and with great contemptuous speech. But that gradually erupted into violence on that night suddenly. It had been working up to that. And that was the night that my father, suddenly his assumptions were shattered. Also, the glass was shattered, but my father's assumptions about writing it out were shattered. We were forced out of that town into the big city of Cologne. And there he found for me a place on the Kindertransport, which was a rescue effort. And I believe there are about 10,000 Jewish children who were rescued from Germany, but other countries like Czechoslovakia. And that is such a wonderful rescue. And, a lot of people have been talking about the film about Nicholas Winton that has been released, which describes this. But it's also very sobering because 1.5 million children perished. And always I think, how is it that I was rescued? I have to really think about that.
Don't you still have your number from the Kinder Rescue of what number you were?
The children had identification labels.
Okay.
And in my particular group, we had a round label, white cardboard with blue letters. And I still have that. And the number is 8814. But when I think about my rescue, the number 8814, there were 10,000 children rescued. So I kind of came at the end. But it is a continuing story because this textile artist I mentioned with a little 6-year-old daughter, she is restoring my story through her art. And a film team has just visited her, and there is a picture of her creating in textile and embroidery the label 8814. And we have that picture, yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was one thing. So when your parents put you on the train, do you have a memory of that at all, of that moment of separation?
That moment of separation was a pivotal moment in my life story because, I explained I was the only child. They were older. There was intense love in the family. And, I think in the Jewish culture, there is a lot of tactile expression of love. And it was, I was loved. And, I think I experienced that for 7 years. And I really believe that was a huge gift, because those first 7 years form a kind of deep foundation for my life. So that was a gift they gave me. But when they put me on the train with my little label on, that was also a shattering moment, because they had told me it was going to be a really great trip and I would enjoy it. So I was kind of a little bit looking forward to it. And so you picture it, it's evening. There are lots and lots of parents milling around, and 100 or more children. And they're all being put on the train. And in Europe at that time, the trains, there were steps up leading up into the carriages, and they were very steep. You didn't just step into them. And so my parents helped me up steps. I was a small child for my age, and so they helped me up. And that moment of before and after happened as I turned around and I looked at them, and I saw their eyes were full of tears. And suddenly I realized this is not a nice trip. I got into the carriage. The carriages were full of children, and they were corridors down the middle, and they were racing and running about. And I sat scrunched up in the corner. There were hardly any adults on the train, just a couple of Red Cross workers. And I can remember, even now, all these years later, one of them pointing to me, trying to calm down these rambunctious children and saying, "Can't you behave like that little girl?" But, I wasn't behaving. I was in a crisis moment of shutdown, and I didn't have any way to negotiate the total loss of everything: security, parents' love. It was like the before and after. My childish way of dealing with it was denial. It was suppression. And that moment in the corner was a really very dramatic closure to the past of my life.
And do you remember, just for our audience sake, do you remember the date that you were put on that train approximately?
Yeah, it's 26th of July, 1939.
Okay.
And the World War II started the 1st of September that year.
When they invaded, Hitler invaded Poland.
Yes.
So you were then transported you eventually made your way, it's England that you made your way to?
Yes.
And then somehow you were able to spend the rest of your childhood in England. Is that correct? Or when did you come to America?
Oh, much, much later.
Okay.
I actually ended up in a place called Coventry. And that's a little bit like going out of the frying pan into the fire, because in history, I don't know if it's well known, but there was in 1941 a blitz in Coventry where there was relentless bombing. Coventry was an industrial center, and Germany wanted to destroy their capability to make weapons and armaments. And I can remember the day after, we lived just outside Coventry. The foster family that took me in lived just outside Coventry, and we had to leave to go into the country. And I can remember sitting in the back seat of a car driving through Coventry with the smoke still rising and the rubble on either side. And we actually drove by the cathedral, and it had been bombed, and there was just the shell left. And the picture that I offered for the beginning and the title, Reconciliation, is actually a sculpture in the empty ground with the shell of the cathedral around it that's there today. And it's Coventry Cathedral became a center for reconciliation.
And that's where
Germany and, you know, Dresden was also a city that the British and the Americans bombed. So there was this reconciliation between these two cities. But that day when we were driving by, I was just conscious of the smoke and the rubble and the ruins, you know.
So did that foster family adopt you, so to speak, and raise you, or did you move around much as a child until you got to your early adult years? Like who raised you, and how was that experience? Were these families you know, on board with the idea of a rescue and caring for you in a good and proper way?
You know, we kind of look back on that time from our social experience of caring for children and understanding of trauma. But at that time, there was little understanding. Mm-hmm. And you have to kind of get the atmosphere in Britain, because Britain was incredibly afraid. They were waiting for Hitler to invade them. You know, Holland, Belgium, France, they had all capitulated. And England was holding its breath for an invasion. So this rescue effort called the Kindertransport, it was a mad scramble to try and help. So people, who could they get to take the children and everything? So that was the background. So there was no one to give counsel to the children. And depending on the family, there was no one to listen to them. And also there is a sort of, at that time in Britain especially, you call it the stiff upper lip. Mm-hmm. It's how you deal with difficulty. You just grit your teeth and keep going. And so that was what I faced. And the family that took me in, I have to say, they took care of me physically. And it was a wonderful thing. But as far as emotion and tenderness,
affection,
that was missing. So, you know, like when I shut down in the train, it kind of went on. And I actually took on a kind of new identity, because actually it was not safe to have an accent or to be a foreigner. You know, there have been times in American history where, like the Japanese, it was wartime and there was a lot of fear associated about that. And in England, there was a lot of fear about spies and fifth columns. And for me, there was this pressure to fit in, to kind of merge into the background. So I can remember standing at school, and it was just before Christmas, and all the children together were singing Christmas carols. And, you know, there were no words up or anything. Everybody knew them. And I hadn't got a clue. But I really tried not to be different. So I just moved my mouth without knowing any words. So that's a little picture of this attempt. And, you know, that is a really disastrous thing, not just for a refugee child. I think for anyone to kind of pretend and have a persona that we project, which isn't authentic, that is really harmful. And for me, that all those things contributed to a crisis. I think the deepest pain was the sense of bitterness and anger towards Germany. And, this is a very shameful thing to say, and I've heard other survivors say this, I felt my parents had abandoned me. Can you believe that? But that is a child's view. They had actually given the greatest gift of love, sacrificial love, that's beyond explanation. But in my child's perception, they had left me, and I was alone because they'd let me go. And all that inner turmoil, the bitterness against Germany, the closing off to my parents, the pretense that came to a crisis by the time I was an early adult. Mm-hmm. I was teaching in a country school in England, and I was gradually coming to the end of my rope. And, I think about the timing of things in our lives. I don't think it's explainable just by ignoring God and his great mercy. Because at the moment when I was at the end emotionally, all my big efforts to control everything, to control the world around me, to control myself, and to put a lid on the bitterness and anger, I was coming to the end of that. And at that time, I was teaching in England, and Billy Graham was the sensation in England. It's hard to believe, but he was the talk of the country. And even in this small town in South England where I was teaching, it was really, it was the buzzword. And so out of curiosity, not out of spiritual hunger, I went to hear him. And I sat with local people who knew me. The place was packed. And it was a radio relay. It wasn't, alive. He wasn't there. We just heard the voice. And, I have to tell you this, that by this time I was very British, and I was a little bit looking down on this American big show, the music and all the big things. So I was sitting there, as an observer, remote, and a little bit superior. But when he started to talk, I believe God was really speaking through him. And I was so deeply touched. And, I could see Jesus was wanting me to give all that anger and bitterness and hatred and distress to him. And it was a very hard thing to do, to publicly get up and walk to the front, acknowledging my need, because people knew me. I was the school teacher. But I think I was so desperate, and I think God's grace was so manifest that I got up. And, that was the beginning of the long, long journey to forgiveness and to healing.
So that was the starting point of the reconciliation of just your own emotional trauma and imbalance of the bad emotions that you needed an outlet for. So in that vein,
I would just say it was also reconciliation with God, because I was separated from God. We don't like saying the word sin these days, but hatred, bitterness, anger, desire for revenge, all those things were in estrangement. They estranged me from God. But, God took the initiative, and then I responded. I think that's reconciliation.
So God reached out to you through Billy Graham, this American evangelist who puts up big tents.
I did not see that coming.
For this little Jewish girl out of Germany. So that brings me kind of to my next question. So you become reconciled with God, and you begin that journey of living in the light instead of under the oppression of all those bad emotions left over from your trauma. Did you have any knowledge at all of what happened to your parents? I mean, clearly they perished under Hitler's regime, but did you ever find out exactly what their route was or anything like that? And did that help you, not just through your experience of coming to God, but was that one way to help you forgive them, so to speak, or at least give their actions, recognize those as merciful, as well as the ultimate act of love, sacrificial, actually?
Boy, those are good questions. I would also add to the whole Billy Graham thing, there was actually a group of believers, followers of Jesus, in that little town. It was called Horsham, West Sussex. And they came from all the different Christian groupings. They weren't just one. And they had been praying, especially for young people in their city. And, here's my story that I'm telling, but there were maybe 20 or 30 other young people who did the same thing, coming from different backgrounds.
From there, yeah.
So it was God, yes, but it was also these followers of Jesus who were very engaged in prayer. It was Billy Graham, yes, but it was also God speaking, and it was like a shared initiative, and I think that's really important today when we think about how should we live, and how we relate. But and I've lost my train of thought. What was the question you asked after that?
I was just wondering. Now, I appreciate what you said, because that reminds me of something that I heard recently in a Bible study, that of course God's plan and God's will is going to happen no matter what. But He invites us. He invites every believer to participate in that plan, and how we participate is the prayers and the other activities we do in our community or with our neighbors or friends, etc. So that's an excellent point, that you were going to be saved by grace, and Jesus was coming after you no matter what, but that community got to participate. And that's treasure for them in heaven, I think.
Yeah.
But I was asking you if you ever found out your parents, what their pathway ended up being.
Like, I'm 92, so this is an incredibly long story,
So we're going to refer people to your book.
But you see, the whole thing of being forgiven evoked in me, the Lord nudged me to begin the process of forgiveness. So here's the process of forgiveness. It's a long journey. Back there in Horsham, in the days after that experience, I really had a sense I needed to ask God to forgive me for my bitterness and hatred towards Germany. But it's one thing to do that across the British Channel. I'm in Horsham, they're over there, and that all happened. And then you think, are there any people alive who were implicit in this event in my town? And fast forward several years later, my husband and I went back to this town, and we began to meet people. And the process of reconciliation began there in Gmünd, my original hometown. And I think if we kind of start to open our hearts and just take those first steps in responding to God's initiative, incredible things happen. I mean, I met the woman, she was then in her early 90s. She had been a teenager when I was a baby, and she had been our living maid. And I encountered her. And you asked about the reconciliation with my parents. You see, I only had kind of the minimal sense of who they were. And Lisbeth, this previous living maid, began to fill in stories about my mother and father, which kind of made them into real people. And so I could reconcile with them in a more authentic way, you know. I mean, I don't know, we've been talking a long time. I mean, there's a long story, because the end of that story, did I reconcile with my parents, was to actually go on a journey to Poland and follow their steps when they were deported and gassed. I mean, I can talk about that as well, because that was it was a huge deal, you know, in my
How old were
story.
you? How old were you when you went on that journey to Poland to retake their steps and to discover, you know, the road that they took? How old were you?
Well, I 75.
Oh, okay.
I mean, this is a long
Road.
story.
Yeah. So
And, you know, I think it's an encouragement, because I think most of us have things in our lives that we would like resolved or healed or changed. And I think my story is an indication how patient God is.
Mm-hmm.
And how we can trust him. You know, the moment we can trust him to lead us, I think he will take us through dark, you know, like the psalmist says, although I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Going to Poland was like going through the valley of the shadow of death.
Mm-hmm.
But it took so long before I was ready to do it, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then how did you, when you were being raised, I'm going to shift the topic a little bit, if you don't mind. You know, you're raised in England with this foster family that certainly materialistically gave you everything you needed to grow up, and education. Even obviously you became a school teacher, and you were a young person before you became a Christian in the sense of believing in Jesus as your savior, not a Christian by tradition, you know, molding into the society, which was a Christian society. How much of your Jewish identity did you retain or think about once you got to England and as you grew up? Did you ever think about, well, I even though as a child you were trying to fit in, so clearly you're probably hiding that or not talking about it, but as you got older, did you ever try to re-examine? I know you mentioned the you're 100% Ashkenazi and you're a believer in Jesus as Messiah. Those things also have to reconcile, because there is such a rich history and anointment to your heritage, in addition to your faith. The foreground of your faith is in your heritage. Do you have any thoughts you can share about how you perceive yourself as a Jewish believer in Jesus, or how you work that into your life, as far as, do you identify as Jewish, but I believe in Jesus? Like, how do you navigate that, especially when you tell your story to groups of either school children or maybe synagogues or churches or wherever you get a chance to share your story?
You know, I think I'm a really slow learner, because it took many, many years for me to really embrace my Jewishness. But there have been some very dramatic kind of interventions, I think, on the part of God in this. And I'll mention too, because I really submerged my Jewishness into my discipleship, my desire to follow the teaching of Jesus. One of the big things that God used to help me kind of discover who I really am, what is my identity, is a group called Yahad B'Yeshua. And I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but it is a recent, in the last 10 or so years, phenomena that there are many, many Jews who are in the churches. This is a group where there are authentic Jews who are in the Catholic Church, who are in the Orthodox Church, or in the Evangelical Church, and who are in Messianic synagogues, groups of Messianic believers. But there are some who actually attend a regular Jewish synagogue, and they do it telling the truth about them being followers of Jesus, but they are accepted. And this has been an enormous help for me in my personal life and in my life as a Messianic Jew, because I'm accepted. You know, one of the things for a Jew who is a follower of Jesus, you don't really feel at home. You don't really feel at home in the Jewish community, and you don't really feel at home in the church, because actually the church doesn't really understand you. And so you're like a hyphen, you're living between. And I think Yahad B'Yeshua has given me this groundwork, and to really believe that God has led me into my circumstances, and in my circumstances I can be a person who shares what God has done for me. Another thing that's really, really recent is that I was invited to be on the board of the local Phoenix Holocaust Association. And you know, everything that happens in my life is like beads on a necklace. Every bead leads to the next. So I have this friend who said to me, why don't you apply to tell your story on the Shoah Foundation? You know, what Steven Spielberg started, but now they have all these testimonies. And lo and behold, the woman who they sent to interview me is a local person. She's an incredible person. And she interviewed me, and afterwards she invited me to come on the board of the local Phoenix Holocaust Association. And she knows that I'm a follower of Jesus. Anyway, I'm feeling very welcomed. And in fact, every month we have what's called Cafe Europa. So the German government pays for the Phoenix Holocaust Association to have a luncheon once a month for Holocaust survivors. So we go to this, and there are all sorts of second and third generation survivors, and then friends from the community. They're not necessarily Christian, they're from the academia, and we all meet. So even at this late stage in my life, I'm kind of really enjoying having genuine friendships with Jews.
Well, to me, that's another form of reconciliation. It's one of our missions at the Jerusalem Connection to reconcile Christians and Jews, and that's all embodied in all of you. So you're Jewish, then you're Christian, and then you're still like, so we're grafted in, but you're like the original stock, and then you got extra flowers or something, because bearing a lot more fruit, I think, than you realize. But that's just beautiful. So as as you now in feeling like there's a home, you're accepted, and you don't have to play one persona or another, you are you. Are you at all feeling any of the increased tension we've all witnessed in the last 6 months? But are you personally feeling any of this anti-Semitism that's bubbling up? Like when you see something online or in the newspaper, whether it's from a student protest or just some graffiti, I mean, is that it hurts us, Shelley and I, it hurts us personally in an empathetic way, but do you take it personally because this is actually your heritage? I mean, I just wanted to see how you fit into today's atmosphere. If there's anything that we can do, we're doing all we can to support and aid the Jewish community, and that's all their members, right? Because they are the target right now for so much anti-Semitism. And I just was wondering how you're personally perceiving it, or do you feel like you've got your new cocoon of Jesus, and it's more about praying for others?
I think this is an incredibly delicate topic, and I think it's very multifaceted. And I think, speaking for me personally, I'm very affected by the fact that my parents, like many Jews, did not, they pushed away what was happening, and they hoped everything would go away. So, of course, I am reading and listening, and my antenna are everywhere. So I have that. But I would say that in reality, I am not personally touched yet by what's happening. I mean, when Shelley and I met in Tucson, it was at this event that the University of Arizona had put on, and there had been planned a reception in a separate building. And so that had to be moved into the building where the event took place because there were demonstrations. I mean, that's the nearest I got to anything. Mm-hmm. But I hear from my textile artist friend and her little 6-year-old girl about how she's kind of struggling how to help her, because the little girl says, you know, Christians hate Jews. That's what the girl said. So, and I'm aware that this can tip over. But, so that's one thing. But another thing is, I'm also very aware of the troubles in Israel. You know, I think about the government in Israel, and there are many questions to ask. You know, we've talked about authoritarianism, the threats in America, the threats in Europe. I think there are also threats in Israel. So for me, it isn't that Israel can do no wrong, and the Palestinians are all evil. So I think my only recourse is that I really believe in the ultimate end for all things of righteous judgment. I really believe that God is the righteous judge. And my desire is for reconciliation. And there are Jews and there are Arabs who have reconciled. But I'm not putting my head in the sand and saying things are going to go well. I mean, we are really, I mean, it's not only Israel and Gaza. You know, what about Ukraine? I mean, this has enormous consequences, how that goes. So all that drives me to be realistic and look, but deep in my heart, it drives me to God's sovereignty. He is Lord.
Hannah, before we go, can you tell us what is going on? I know that there's a documentary being filmed. Is it about your life or your story? And how do we watch it? Will it be ready?
This is another thing that's quite amazing. We have a couple whose identity is Global Story Films, and they have produced a number of films, and they have done a lot of interviews to tell my story. And I think the film is going to be called 8814, which is the number that was on my label. But here's this I just did a beautiful couple doing this film. But also through Instagram, I have met Holocaust historians. There is a woman called Dr. Amy Williams, whose doctor's degree is on the Kindertransport. So she has this enormous information. There is her professor who was over her called Bill Niven, whose expertise is Germany and the Holocaust. And there is another historian, all through Instagram, Imogen. Her expertise has been on really the death camps and the concentration camps. They all have interacted with my story, so they have just been giving interviews in England, and they actually went to the house that I arrived at in England, in Coventry, and they photographed the tile in the front. There's the front door, and on the floor is the tile that I remember seeing as a 7-year-old child. That just gives me goosebumps, And they actually went to school, my first school in England that I attended. So there are all these pictures, and they went to Coventry Cathedral, and they took pictures of the reconciliation sculpture. And then Bill Niven, who spends some of his time in Germany, sent a picture of the same sculpture in Berlin. So here we have a sculpture of reconciliation, 2 figures embracing in Coventry and one in Berlin. And I just feel the finger of God in this film. And the desire for the movie is not just to tell my story, but show what in the midst of all the horror, there are just these touches of God's love.
Wow.
How does art play a role in the documentary? Because I know when I first met you, I said, I'm Shelley Neese. I work with an organization that we do Holocaust education through art. And both of us sort of just stood back of like, you're like, I do too, So tell me how art plays a role in the documentary as well.
Well, Dr. Amy Williams has connections all over the world. And she connected me with Laura Nathan through Instagram. Laura Nathan's grandmother was on the Kindertransport, and her grandfather survived Auschwitz. Her grandmother could never, ever talk about the Holocaust or say very much about her experience. It was too painful. And so her granddaughter is really engaged. She wants to know what happened. She's done enormous research, and she has created these award-winning kind of textile sculptures of her grandmother's story. And when I saw what she'd done, the photographs, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if Laura would do something about my story? But I didn't say anything. I just prayed about it. And, you know, the filmmakers are challenged because there are very few pictures to illustrate my story. And just gradually, the whole idea came that Laura should do research. And so she has created scenes from Gmünd of my parents and I, the swimming pool where no Jews were allowed, and the citizens doing a Heil Hitler salutes. So all this is done with embroidery, like on organza, on kind of moving fabric. So it's really a kind of really modern art, but I think it expresses the emotions and takes the viewer into a very personal experience of the story.
Well, that's amazing. We are going to share the details of how folks can follow you, find you and follow you on Instagram. We'll also share where they can get your book, and then any information on the documentary, we'll be sure to put those links in so that people can look out for it. But Hanna,
I do love that you can we just repackage? Hanna is a 92-year-old Holocaust survivor whose favorite media platform is Instagram, who came to faith in Jesus through Billy Graham and is a big fan of incorporating modern art into her storytelling. Like, you are a beautiful enigma, and I love it.
Yeah. Aren't we all? We're all enigmas.
But we just thank you, Hanna, and we're going to pray for your endeavors and your fortitude to continue with your bright smile and your optimistic outlook. And I mean, we can just see the Spirit moving in your life, and we can see the Spirit through you. And for us, that's very encouraging. And we're happy to share your story. And as the productions come to fruition, be sharing them again. And maybe once the documentary's out, we'll have you back and we can talk about the reception that it's getting, and where people can find it, or host screenings, those kinds of things. So we will definitely be following up. Thank you, Hanna.
Thank you. This is an exhilarating experience to talk with you.
We're blessed to have you. Stay tuned, folks. More to come.